In today's IT landscape, cybercriminals are using AI to make attacks faster, more complex, and harder to stop. The real question is, when an attack happens, how quickly can you respond and get your business running again? We're talking about the inevitable, AI-accelerated attacks, and how to stay resilient when, not if, something gets through. Today we'll unpack how Lenovo and Absolute Security work together at the firmware level to keep endpoints controllable and businesses online. Joining me are Christy Wyatt, President and CEO of Absolute Security, and Patricia Wilkey, Senior Vice President and General Manager of Lenovo's International Sales. Let's get started. Thank you so much for joining me today on this podcast. It's a pleasure to have you both. Before we get started, would you like to just give a short synopsis of who you are and what you do at your team? We'll start with you, Christy.
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me. I'm Christy Wyatt. I'm the president and CEO of Absolute Security. We've been a longtime partner of Lenovo, and what we uniquely do is we focus on cyber resilience for endpoint devices, and I'm sure we'll talk a lot about what that looks like, but together we work with 22,000 customers around the world, and we're excited to be here.
So great to see you again, Rita and Christy. It's been some time, so great to be here live with you as well. I lead our services business for Lenovo, everything outside of China. And in that, it is key in bringing our go-to-market and our solutions with our very strategic relationships as we have with Absolute, and helping our customers in any aspect. So whether it is tied in to the end user environment, the security framework, to the infrastructure, and all around the applications. So bringing those services worldwide.
This is going to be a great conversation. We're really focused on the security side of things today. And a lot of the conversations we've had on this podcast have been rooted from the research we've done through Work Reborn. And I'd love to tee that conversation up by starting with you, Patricia. From Lenovo's research, what's the number one cybersecurity problem customers are worried about today? What are you seeing?
Well, we all know about AI that's affecting everyone's lives, and I don't think you can even escape it today. But what's happening now is the concern. Over 90% of our audience out there are concerned on how those threats are really coming through with cybersecurity dangers, all using AI instead of in the positive way to help us, but AI creating the threat, whether it's an enterprise or even a personal user in those aspects. So it's really affecting everything that they see. And that's the threat, as well as the tools that they need to use to be able to block and control that. Not only the tool itself, but also the people and their knowledge. So that's what we're seeing and finding in our Work Reborn analysis.
Christy, I would love to hear a little bit more into this positive approach of how cybersecurity and AI are better together. I hear that your team at Absolute really leads with this idea of cyber resilience. From a customer's perspective, what gap does that fill compared to traditional prevention-focused security?
Sure. So first of all, I wholeheartedly agree with what Patricia just said. I think it's very consistent with what we're seeing across the customer base. The number one thing on folks' mind is continuity and resilience, and ransomware is, by all means, sort of the number one thing. And we saw even just last week, our first series of attacks that were really being done using AI. So I think that this is top of everybody's mind, and it doesn't really matter whether it's an AI-generated attack or whether it's some other form of traditional malware. If it takes a user down, it's going to interrupt the service within your business. And so the way we view security is slightly different. I think there's a very large community of folks that are really focused on, if you think of the NIST framework, there's prevention and detection, and there's lots of folks that are focused on these categories, how to prevent bad things from happening. We can be helpful there, but where we really shine is on resilience and remediation. So a very popular way for bad actors to get in is to compromise your security controls themselves. We have the capability to actually persist or make those controls somewhat undeletable and sort of restore them whenever they go down. We give a tremendous amount of data and visibility and control from within the hardware itself so that you have a a really locked in view of what assets you have, where they are, and whether they're working. And then when something goes wrong, either an application fails or a device itself becomes compromised, because we're built into the hardware itself, we can restore it and heal it. And so one of the things we talk a lot about is something we call rehydration, which is the ability to actually, go as so far as to remotely reinstall or restore that device from bare metal, again, starting from sort of the pre-boot cycle. And so we're really very much focused on that long tail. If you look at where the real cost of a breach comes from, there's a significant amount of damage that's done in the event itself, but it's the cost of getting everything back up and online. And I'm sure Patricia sees that in her world every single day, right? I mean, this is where customers really suffer. They probably did tabletop exercises to talk about how to prevent the bad thing or what do you do in the heat of the moment of the bad thing. Very few of those exercises go all the way to the end of the tape where, users are back online and doing work.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well, Patricia. The landscape is definitely changing. The attack surface as well is expanding as well when it comes to laptops and cloud and remote work. And something like this feature that you're talking about, Christy, is really exceptional because this is really a growing challenge for IT leaders. I think it's part of the problem. So why do you think this is a challenge, and how can things like this invisible IT kind of cool feature that Christy is talking about be helpful?
Yeah, so I think the first comes back to what are we protecting? We talk with our customers, depending what industry they're in. There's different aspects on it. It might be their customers' information. It might be their brand. I met with an insurance agency that had a brand that was over 150 years old. And they said, could you imagine if any aspect of the data of our customers went out there? What does it do to a brand that's over 150 years old? It can ruin it forever. And so the importance of maintaining controls and processes around data. Now, what's happening is that as AI comes into the play, it's changing every day. I was meeting with one data scientist who said it's like a dog year of what you might have, how dog years are a little more than what a human is. But basically, they were calling AI by week is a dog year. It's leaping every
Oh, wow.
day. Exactly. Crazy. So the challenge is that people can't keep up with it. And so this is why you need to depend on experts that live and breathe this every day, who are bringing their research and development to make sure that they're thinking of all aspects of what could come in, what entry point could come in to damage the application or the data around it. And so this is why we look from what you've heard us before say, from pocket to cloud, what's taking on, whether it's starting in your mobile device or going into your laptop or your full workstation to the infrastructure that's running the apps behind it. We want to make sure that we're bringing those solutions and the tools that are there to keep you sleeping at night as maybe a CIO, a CISO, even think of the CMO, right? And that chief marketing officer. So this is why it becomes important to make sure that we have the right solutions that can, one, prevent, but more importantly, as Christy said, we know that there's risk and it's going to happen at some point in time. So we want to have the best foundation to be able to quickly resolve or protect as quick as possible.
I think Patricia's exactly right in terms of the dog years. I've never heard that, but I think I might steal that. I think as AI has kind of been maturing, we talk a lot about human in the loop. But if you think about an AI facilitated attack, right, you might not have time. Like, it takes your response time down to seconds, not, weeks, hours, minutes. And so the fact that we're building these capabilities into the hardware itself, that means that as we mature, as a platform and collectively as an industry and a series of practitioners, we have to be able to respond in that lightning fast time as well, right? You may not be able to rely on, somebody actually getting into the loop and having time to understand what's going on. You sort of want shields to go up automatically and then come in later. And I think that introduces a second really interesting concept, which is around the intelligence. So we talk about persistence, resilience, and intelligence. Being able to have that fine-grained, really detailed information about what happened, because you may not have been able to get there in time to participate in the response, but you're really going to want people to sit down and understand what just happened there. Was that a human that did something? Was that a response to some vendor? Was that like what actually just went on? And so that ability to collect data at a really low level within the platform and be able to sort of, again, incorporate what the device knows about itself into that conversation is a really, really powerful tool.
It's so well said. From what I'm hearing and understanding, these topics aren't just IT department issues anymore. They're entire business issues because that downtime can cost more than just a couple of bucks. It can be the entire integrity of the brand or the data. And with AI now being used by attackers at this rate, it's creating endless new threats. And I'm sure there are teams that are struggling to keep up with that pace on their own. The human teams that are questioning, well, if AI is attacking us, then, well, why should we be using it to help us as well? So what does that look like from your perspective? Either of you can speak to that.
Well, I'll tie in that the resilience play is what we really need to focus on that. And yes, there's prevention, but you have to make sure that you're in a model where you can maintain the control as much as you possibly can. Because once inside, it could laterally just cross your whole ecosystem, even expanding to your own customers, right? And continue on. So this is why it becomes so important, as Christy stated, having it embedded to begin with gives you that extra protection that you can really move for. And with that, you can take control as much as you can, right, Christy? I know it's hard out there, but these are different aspects that can make it in a model where you can, to some level, minimize that costly downtime. Make sure that you're protecting your reputation. And really, how do you even, from a regulation perspective, minimize the risk of those penalties that might come in?
Yeah.
Christy, you want
I think the regulatory regulatory landscape is because it's like a whole other podcast. I think that I think AI is just a tool, right? And so whether it's a tool being used by the bad actors or a tool being used by your own department, I thought there was a very well-known cyber AI researcher that said, think of it as hiring an army of employees, right? These are just sort of tools and resources that you are sort of using to multiply and amplify the power of the employees you already have so that they can have broader reach and they can move faster, right? So we're arming our folks to be more impactful within the organization. And so I don't really think of it as, if the AI is attacking us, I think of it as an individual or an organization is coming after something, and we have to be able to protect ourselves. And that's what resilience is. I think the other thing Patricia touched on is downtime. And I think we really believe that downtime is the metric of the breach, right? We like to say we stop downtime. I think that what we mean by that is, our focus is on making that as short as possible. How do we get folks to protect your brand, to protect your data, to protect your customers? What's important is that folks get up and online as quickly as possible, whatever that takes. And I remember talking to the CISO of a very well-known bank, and we were talking about their tabletop exercises. And I said, imagine you had 5,000 remote employees that got taken by ransomware. What do you do? And we went back and forth a little bit. And the answer was, some group of people go to a secure location. And I said, great, but you've got 5,000 employees out there who can't do anything. What are they going to do? And he said, well, I don't know. They box up their systems and they ship them back. And then somebody cleans them and sends them back to them. I mean, we're talking weeks, right? There's got to be a better way. And so I think those are the places where we look at that long tail of downtime and say, oh, we can do better, right? We can do that in minutes. That's an easy thing, not an easy, but it's a solvable problem.
Tell me a little bit more, Christy, about absolute security being embedded at the firmware level from the perspective of a customer. Like, what does that mean for the customer, and how does it give them control, even if the device is offline or compromised?
So the way to think of it is, there's a tiny piece of technology embedded in the unflashable part of the firmware that on its own doesn't do a tremendous amount. A customer needs to actually activate it. They can activate that with Lenovo directly when they're purchasing the hardware. They can purchase it later from Lenovo or from ourselves and activate it after the fact. But once it's done that, the very first thing that device does when it's waking up is sort of checks for what it's supposed to be doing, right? So you would install an agent that just looks like any other agent that you would get from a security vendor. And it is what activates that piece in the hardware. And it's kind of asking, am I okay? So you could wipe out the operating system in that device. You could switch hard drives. The first thing it's going to do is restore that service. So it's going to make sure that Absolute is up and online. So that's that unbreakable connection we talk about. The next thing you can do is you can there's a fair amount of visibility and control. So you can do things like freezing, locking, wiping, crypto level wiping. So if you have, if you're in healthcare and you need certificates generated about whether the device was properly cleaned or not, all sort of remotely and from within the firmware. And then we do some interesting things around what we call application health. So most CISOs I know have more security agents than they ever hoped they would have. I think it's a common cry across the industry right now. But let's assume that you're relying on, 10, 15 agents. These are things like your SentinelOne or your CrowdStrike or your Intune or all of the things you rely on to keep your organization secure. The fact is they're running maybe 70, 80% of the time. Now, it's not unusual for these to kind of go offline. So we're sort of monitoring the posture and compliance of that device from within the device. And if one of those things becomes compromised, we're going to fix it the same way we fix ourselves. We're going to restore it, repair it, reconfigure it, reinstall it, whatever we need to do. And then I've sort of described the ability to rebuild the device after the fact. The only other thing I'd sort of mention is we have this other very cool set of capabilities around access. So think of zero trust. Compliance and connectivity have a really interesting relationship. Like, should you be letting non-compliant devices even connect to your network? And once connected, how do you build that highly resilient connection back to your organization? And so there's a suite of products we have called Secure Access. But pretty much everything we do connects back to resilience. How do we make sure you know where your things are, that they're secure, they're compliant, they're up and running, they're able to connect and actually transact and do business? How do we make sure that user can work? That's the focus.
I think that focus is really in line with the research for Work Reborn. We're basically seeing that hybrid work, multiple devices, different endpoints, they are inevitable in the next era of work. And it's not just about, that one use case you were talking about with the gentleman who was like, you just take the device, you ship it back, and that's it. That's how you fix the problems. I think the landscape really is changing, and these solutions are very valuable. Patricia, from Lenovo's standpoint, how are we turning the control that we're seeing into business outcomes like faster recovery, less downtime, maybe in a more technical sense or perspective that a CIO listening might not have considered before?
So I think two areas that I'd like to focus on. One is understanding the actual profiles of the user that are interacting with that data. And with our Care of One platform, we're able to really understand what access, what data, what is that profile getting into, and what type of support do they need. But then also tied into that is our cyber resilience service, where we really are using telemetry data to predict, detect, and automatically resolve those issues so that we're minimizing the disruption that end user might have in whatever task or work that they're doing. So all of this comes together and really translates into a less downtime, keeping our employees productive as much as possible. And maybe it's certain tasks or areas, but we're able to create that foundation and bring that forward. I think the last piece comes in around the technology that we're using with Absolute to be able to ensure that there is tangible business outcomes and value that we're looking at. All of it, I think, comes down to a trust factor. And how do we, with our relationship with Absolute, come help our customers and making sure that there's all levels of business continuity and whatever they're looking at and driving. So it could be a certain task area that's internal. It could be touching our customer's customer. It could be those regulations. It could be compliance aspects, but enable to bring these solutions to predict, detect, and resolve. That's the focus that we're bringing to help and make sure sometimes we call it a safe pair of hands to the level that you can as AI is coming in and even using the AI telemetry ourselves to make sure that we're keeping abreast of whatever transaction or point or log that's going on in that customer's environment.
On a recent episode at an event, I asked a business leader who uses our products or services why they chose Lenovo, and in one word, and he said trustworthiness. And I think for any CIO, C-suite leader, whatever in tech, like that's really a priority. And that's what we're trying to deliver through this partnership is, of course, the services, the features, but, being able to rely on those things to continually work. Christy, from your perspective, talk to me a little bit from the human side, things that you do to also remain that trustworthy provider so that when things, don't go well or, businesses need help, you're always there to be that continuous source of help.
I think trust is a loaded word, and it's a very powerful concept for us. We, I think maybe 6 or 7 years ago, we set an aspiration for ourselves to be the world's most trusted cybersecurity company. And the word trust for us translated into something very specific. We believe trust has to be rooted in something real. There has to be something you can really ground that trust into. And so in a universe where there are literally thousands of cybersecurity solutions you could run on a device, if you went and took 5 of them and asked and ran a report about what devices you have and where they were, you would probably get 5 very different answers, right? The fact that we're rooted in something real, we're rooted in the hardware itself, gives us that anchor. And so when we look at any one of the business problems we're trying to solve with our joint customers, we're asking ourselves, how can we sort of raise the bar? How do we do it in a more resilient way? How do we do it in a more trusted way? So, a lot of our customers will use our data as one example, right, as the place they correlate or sort of verify the data they're getting from other platforms, right? If a device stops calling in, you can't protect it anymore. So that sort of undeletable connection, that sort of permanent tether to those pieces of hardware gives you that heartbeat, right? Another place would be, if we think about the recent BSOD event, even though that was like over a year ago, but we've had many supply chain incidents since then of software vendors having some bad day of some sort. And it's not always the result of a bad actor. Sometimes it's just an unfortunate event. You need something that you can kind of reach underneath and kind of still get back to the truth, right? Still get a service end user sort of back up and running. And so to us, the trust means something very specific and unique. It means you have to rely on us. And when everything else fails, that morning we got phone calls that said, look, you're underneath it all. What can you do to help? Right. And I think that's meaningful to us. So we look at that as how do we broaden or sort of deepen the definition of resilience and trust within those solutions? Give the administrator or the analyst sort of another tool for them to be able to get to the root of the truth or to be able to restore something that was just a minute ago unrecoverable.
Patricia, what do you think about that?
So I absolutely agree. And that trust factor, maybe some of our legal teams don't want us to put that in there, but that's what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to be known as not just a vendor, but a trusted advisor, a trusted partner with our customers. And I think with what Absolute and Lenovo can do, we're bringing those tools. I'll share a story with you. I travel a bit around the world, and I was with a client recently who was newer in his role, and he had end users in, I think it was 12 different countries, and he was losing devices. And I said, what do you mean you're losing devices? Well, somehow in this certain city, we lost 50 devices. I'm like, what do you mean? And he's like, well, we stored them on-prem and they walked out the door and things happened. And he was seeing sprinkles of this throughout his organization. And so this is why we said, well, how about if we bring a security solution to help you? And if you're buying Lenovo solutions in our devices with Absolute embedded inside, then we're going to be able to bring a full framework of support for you. So it's not just the monitoring and management, but it's being able to control those assets. Now, luckily, those assets he had lost were probably, sitting in a storage and maybe didn't have data on it so much. But just think if it's your end user who has that confidential data and information. So this is where, as Christy said, there's different aspects that come in. It touches all different levels, depending who you are, what access of information you have. And the more that you can put in some automated process and tools inside, it helps you give, maybe I don't say trust, but some comfort around. And you're probably, Christy's like, say, no, don't let the CISO think that he's comfortable. He should always be on his toes and ready. But it's just a way to put it into play.
Just a fun story, maybe not so fun, but when the pandemic happened and that concept of like devices going missing, and we have a device recovery service. We work with a lot of schools and who let devices go home with kids and all sorts of things. But when the pandemic started happening and people had to work from home for the first time, we were monitoring all of these devices that were lost that were popping back up, right? So we were looking at how many devices that had been reported like lost and hadn't been turned on for like a year or two, all of a sudden popping back up and showing up. And you could tell people were rummaging through cabinets and storage lockers and like, look, found one, you can take this one home. And so that's the thing about persistence, is it stays with you forever.
You got it. For sure.
I think that's a great example. And, as I've spoken to a lot of the CISOs and tech leaders, that's what they're really looking for, is diving into different use cases based on where they are at and what, enterprise they're in. I think everyone's a bit fatigued by just hearing about, this is AI. AI is great. AI can help you. And we agree with that and feel that, but it's also, but how? Like, and what ways? And how can we use it for ourselves? So I wanted to kind of walk through a few different, examples that, we don't have to take individually, but just overall for a small business to mid-market to enterprise, like how are Lenovo and Absolute Security adding these productive and secure features for teams of all sizes, different stages of the business?
Well, why don't I kind of start on that one? I always look at some of the sizing, as you said, in those markets. And let's take the small, medium business entity. I used to be a CFO, so I always battle with how much funding do I have to do whatever project. And if you think of the SMB, one, the livelihood of that company, maybe it's 50 employees, 100, 200 employees, et cetera, but the livelihood is the importance of the access of every one of those employees, keeping that business going. They might not have the full assets behind to come back on that resilience side. So when Lenovo and Absolute embed this protection below the OS level and at a firmware level, it's giving that persistence, visibility, and control that Christy talked about. And so in that, you can be able to make sure that whether that device is offline, online, you can have an access to if it's been compromised. So I think it's with our cyber resilience service at Lenovo, it's designed to help those smaller entities or even the larger, but especially thinking of how do we help in those smaller businesses that are trying to manage through this AI complexity that's out there, and looking at driving automation, having patching, recovery, compliance, whatever the aspect is, but allowing us to help them be successful on it. And so that's where my mind first goes to, is the SMB. Obviously, as you get into mid-market, you start looking at even more complexities coming in and how they have to really balance the tools. The endpoint management is what starts to create that challenge, from the desktop support and being able to help them to whatever aspects that's coming in. Maybe there is some human challenges that are coming in, but the applications, somewhere it's software as a service, maybe it's somebody is walking out with a device. All of that really comes into challenge. And so this way, Lenovo and Absolute can bring solutions to help, whether it is that SMB, that mid-market, et cetera, and being able to manage these multiple complexities.
I agree. And I think that this is an area I have quite a bit of passion, because I think I just wrote an article about this a couple of weeks ago. I was at Black Hat and folks were talking a lot about the cybersecurity poverty line. And so I wanted to know, within North America, let's start there, where is that cybersecurity poverty line? And it was actually fascinating to me. There's an infographic, I think, on LinkedIn or on our website somewhere that we shared. I think it's like 98, 99% of businesses in North America are actually small businesses. And they don't have access to the talent. They don't have the resources, financially or otherwise, to be able to build that mature cybersecurity stack, the NIST framework, whatever we want to sort of describe that. They are also the most targeted population and the least likely to recover. As Patricia just said, their ability to recover from downtime is their livelihood. And I think the statistic I remember is 1 in 5 don't come back, right? They don't get to the other side because the impact was too high. And, I think we are one part of the fabric that sort of helps sustain that ecosystem. But with SMB specifically, I actually think that concept of resilience and getting back is really powerful. I would say it has to be with a strong services offering. And I'm a big fan of services partners, especially within these segments that for really, like if you think some of the world's largest banks and governments still struggle with these events, what chance does like the local clinic have, right? Or what chance does the local power company? By the way, another fun fact is if you sort of looked through that, if you look at critical infrastructure, especially state and local, a lot of them would be categorized size-wise as fitting within the small enterprise or SMB category that Patricia just described. So the stakes can be high, which is why they're incredibly highly targeted. They know that they're vulnerable and that they're least likely to recover, and therefore they're more inclined maybe to pay, or they're, the rewards would be great if somebody were able to get in. And that's why I think the combination of services and some of these, key resilience capabilities can be a really powerful protector against those organizations.
For me, it's really awesome to hear about the potential of how, even though a business might be small or may not have a large team, some of these tools or options would potentially be accessible to them if they're trying to make sure to protect their organizations. So I guess for me, it's exciting to hear that even at a device level, like this is something that's considered overall. What unique advantages do you think, like if everyone is listening to this and they don't take anything away, but they take one thing away regarding the advantages customers will experience through Lenovo and Absolute Security's partnership that they wouldn't get from any other solution alone, what would that one big thing be? Patricia?
One thing, you make it really hard. So I would probably
I know, because there's so many amazing things, right?
Right. I got to go with the protection, right? It's end-to-end protection that spans from the firmware play through to the cloud. It really is bringing that end-to-end protection together. And that's the strength of our partnership, to put it on behalf of our clients out there. Christy, your turn.
I think it's very well said. The thing I try to sort of leave folks with is how you measure. I think what we do is very difficult to measure. And I think that, folks shouldn't be measuring on how many things got through, although that is a impactful metric for the cybersecurity industry, but it's that impact to downtime. How do we minimize your downtime, and how do we make you more resilient overall? And what is the key metric for that? Because bottom line, that's what's going to drive the survivability and whether you can thrive sort of post-event.
So thank you guys so much for joining me on this podcast today. If anyone is interested in learning more about Work Reborn or our partnership here today, please check out the information in the show notes below. And it's been a pleasure to have you both here. And that's all set for our conversation today.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
As we've heard today, cyber threats are not slowing down. But customers don't have to choose between productivity and security. Lenovo and Absolute Security show that resilience is possible, keeping businesses running even when the unexpected happens. Christy, Patricia, thanks so much for joining us today. This has been Work Reborn. Lenovo.